How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Wednesday, Yom Revi'i. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Wednesday evening? Yehuda in South Carolina, Paul in the great Northwest, Nancy in North Carolina, Bella in Florida, Shauna in Canada, Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon in New Jersey, Bill in mid-Missouri, Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, Paula in Chicago, Jonathan in L.A., Marjorie in Georgia, Ella and Ilanit in Silver Spring. Welcome, everybody. Also, Belle in Texas. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by our good friend Wesley Bilson in memory of Judith Wolfe Bilson's 15th yahrzeit. May our learning today accrue to Judith's memory. Accrue to her memory. Can't say it right. May our learning today accrue to Judith's merit in the world to come. Her memory already is for a blessing. May it be forever for a blessing. And Wesley, thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. May you and all your loved ones be blessed in all your ways. And we say Amen. Okay. So I mentioned yesterday there was a possibility that I would be late today. Thank God I wasn't. And there was a good training that I had for the CCW. Sadly, we're living in dangerous times. And I do advocate that with proper training, and I would add extensive proper training, Jews should have firearms, should be prepared to defend themselves, their loved ones, from harm. God forbid the need should arise. You all know that I've told you before, I'm a member of Maganam, a volunteer security force. We're all licensed to carry for exposed carry with insignia like security. We are licensed security guards. We're all volunteered, but we go through the licensing so that we can do that. Today was for CCW, a little bit different. But thankfully, with all the training that I've gone through, when it came time to do the actual qualification with the firearms, I nailed it. So it felt good. I didn't want to embarrass our team at Maganam by not making a good showing, but I did. Okay, our daf today is Yodalid, page 14, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. Excuse me, we're working our way through chapter 1, now discussing Mishna number 6, where the general subject here is we've been talking about lost and found, and what are the obligations of one who finds, what are the rights of one who finds, if it's something that we have good reason to believe the owner has despaired of recovering it, so then you can keep it, and then, who saw it first, who grabbed it first? We started the first Mishnah, two people holding on to a garment, each claiming they found it and are entitled to all of it. Now we're talking about somebody who finds a promissory note, which is evidence of a debt. And the problem is that if it was already used to collect that debt, and then it was given to the borrower who paid off the debt, okay, here's your promissory note back, and then he lost it, and then we find this thing, we say, it says that so-and-so that Reuven owes Shimon this much money, I guess I better give this to Shimon. And now Shimon receives the promissory note back. He might use it to collect again, possibly even innocently, because he's lent money to many people and he doesn't remember that he had this one already paid off. And now he uses it to collect money from Reuven again. So we don't want to give it to the lender. And particularly in a case where this promissory note includes that it is guaranteed by land, because perhaps it will be used to seize land from the borrower, or even land that the borrower sold, and now it's going to be seized from this third party who bought it innocently, not knowing there was a lien on it, and perhaps there wasn't a lien on it because it was already paid off, and now it will be used to seize that land. So we're going to be very careful whom we return this document to. Okay, so we picked this up on 14a, a few lines from the top. Shmuel said, what is the reason for the opinion of the rabbis who say that one can collect a debt from liened property even if the promissory note does not include a property guarantee? Now, we made a sharp distinction in our Mishnah between a promissory note that includes a guarantee that it is guaranteed by real property, by land, and a promissory note that is not guaranteed by real property, and one we can return and one we can't. But now Shmuel said that according to the majority, if you have a promissory note that's not secured by land, you can still use it to collect land, right? Doesn't that mean that, well, then what difference does it make whether it mentions the language of a property, a real property security or not? If you can use it to collect land to pay off a debt, even without that language being included in the promissory note, right? So Shmuel said, what is the reason for the opinion of the rabbis who say that one can collect a debt from liened property even if the promissory note does not include a property guarantee? Now that's interesting that it is liened property. So it sounds like, well, if there's a lien on it, then why wasn't it included in the promissory note? It sounds like the borrower and the lender agreed on the lien, and just the language of their agreement didn't make it into the promissory note. And indeed, what is the reason that they hold this way? The rabbis hold that omission of the property guarantee from the promissory note is a scribal error, as one would certainly not lend money without a property guarantee. So we're not even sure that there was such an oral agreement. It's just that it's unthinkable that one would lend money if there was no security, no collateral. And what collateral? Real property collateral. Really? Is that what we're going to say? Rava bar Itai said to Rav Idi bar Avin, did Shmuel actually say this? I.e. that the omission of this clause is considered a scribal error? But doesn't Shmuel himself say that enhancement, superior quality land, and a lien require consultation? What does this mean, consultation? When a scribe writes a deed of sale for a field, he must ask the seller whether to write explicitly that there is a lien on the field, and the field is then repossessed from the buyer, in which case and if the field, let's just write again. He must write explicitly that if there is a lien on the field, and the field is then repossessed from the buyer, in which case the seller must compensate the buyer for any enhancement of the value of the field that occurred while it was in his possession, and that this compensation will be made from superior quality land, and that he liens all of his land as security for this sale. So let's just review that a little bit. So a seller is selling a field to a buyer. Now, these are terms that they might agree to or might not. In other words, what did they agree on, the buyer and the seller of this field? One is, if it turns out that the seller had a lien on this property because he had borrowed money and pledged this field as the collateral for that loan, so that would mean there was a lien on that land. And if that creditor then later seizes the field from this purchaser, does the purchaser then have the right to come back to the seller and get the money from him? And what's more, if the buyer, while he was in possession of the field before it got seized by the seller's creditor, improved the field, right? Let's say he had it for a year and he worked it, right? And he took all the rocks and stumps out of it and made it into a working field, which it had not been before, right? A producing field, which it had not been before. And then the creditor comes along and seizes it. So is the buyer just going to get his money back when it's taken from him by the seller's creditor? Or is he also going to get a reimbursement of what he invested into that field while it is his? And they also have to agree on that if he's going to be entitled to get his money back if it's seized, and if he's going to be entitled to get back reimbursed for what he invested into that field before it was seized, from what source will he be paid? Is it from the seller's other fields? Is it from his superior quality land? Is it only from his movable property, etc.? Anybody who's ever bought and sold anything, you need a lawyer if it's any kind of significant contract. And these are all the kinds of terms that a lawyer would make sure we came to an understanding about, and that our understanding and our agreement about all these terms was memorialized in the contract. Right? So you can see that the sages, in terms of saying, lawyers have been around for a long time. It's not surprising, but here, as a matter of halacha, right, of Jewish law, these things need the scribe who is drafting this contract, he needs to ask. Now, he's not a lawyer. His job is just to write it down. But he is obligated to ask the buyer and seller, have you agreed to these terms, and what did you agree about them? So this indicates that Shmuel holds that a property guarantee is not written in every promissory note. It's not assumed. If it's going to be part of the promissory note, it's because the parties agreed to it, the scribe asked them about it, and then it was written into the contract. So the Gemara asks, shall we say that one who says this statement quoting Shmuel does not say that statement quoting Shmuel? Meaning, it seems like Shmuel is self-contradictory. Perhaps it is a dispute between the Amoraim who transmitted the statements of Shmuel. So it seems like Shmuel said two contradictory things. Did he contradict himself because he forgot what he said earlier? Did he change his mind later in his life? Or did two people who are transmitting statements in the name of Shmuel, one of them got it wrong? So the Gemara answers, this is not difficult, la kasha. Here, where Shmuel says that the omission of a property guarantee is a scribal error, it is with regard to a promissory note. As a person does not give away his money for nothing. When one lends his money, he requires a property guarantee. Now recall that when a Jew is lending money to another Jew, he can't get interest, right? So if he's doing it, it is as a favor, but what he wants is to have some surety that he's going to be paid back. There, by contrast, where Shmuel said that a scribe must consult with the seller with regard to writing a property guarantee, it is with regard to a case of buying and selling land. Lending money versus buying and selling land, these are distinct realms of the law. As a person is apt to purchase land for a day, it is conceivable that the buyer is willing to risk that there is a prior lien on the land, thinking that even if he owns the property only for one day, he can earn a profit. Maybe he's just renting the land. Maybe he's renting it. Maybe he's willing to give a small price for the land, thinking that it might well be taken away from him, but he can make some money in the meantime, right? It's kind of worthless land. Nobody's using it for anything, but he knows that that the circus is coming to town, and that he could rent this land to the circus, for a few weeks so that they could pitch their tent there, or they could use it for a parking lot there, and he could make some money. And then if he loses the land afterwards, so what, right? Now the Gemara asks, shall we say that the one who says this statement, quoting Shmuel, does not say that statement? Wait a minute. I just said that, I'm sorry. So as evidence of this distinction, the Gemara gives an example. It is like that incident in which Avu bar Ihi purchased a loft from his sister, and her creditor came and repossessed the loft from him. Let's keep it straight. So Avu bar Ihi purchased a loft, an apartment, from his sister, and then his sister's creditor came and repossessed the loft from him. Got it? So he came before Mar Shmuel to file a claim against his sister, right? He bought an apartment. He thought it was his. Then her creditor came and seized it from him. Who's he going to look to for compensation? The seller, in this case, his sister. So he comes for a ruling. Shmuel said to him, did she write you a guarantee in the deed of sale? He said to Shmuel, no. Shmuel said to him, if so, go to peace. Meaning there is nothing that can be done. He said to Shmuel, but wasn't it you, master, who said that omission of a guarantee of the sale from the document is a scribal error? And Shmuel said to him, this statement applies only to promissory notes, but with regard to deeds of buying and selling, it does not apply, as a person may purchase land for a day. People are known to do that, right? So now what we're learning, still going back to what we've been talking about, which is the promissory note, it sounds like that if the borrower has land, then even if the property guarantee is not written into the promissory note, still the creditor can collect from his land using that promissory note. It's like it creates a lien. Now, does that lien stay with the land? If the borrower sells his field, can the creditor then go and seize that field from the purchaser, even though the lien on the land was not memorialized in the promissory note? We don't know yet. Abaye said, consider the case of Reuven, who sold a field to Shimon with a property guarantee. So purchase and sale and property guarantee included in the deed. And Reuven's creditor came and repossessed the field from Shimon as he had a prior lien on the property. It is the halacha, the law, that Reuven can go and litigate with the creditor, and the creditor cannot say to him, I am not legally answerable to you since I am taking the field from Shimon. And this is because Reuven can say to his creditor, that which you take from him comes back to me, as I sold the field to Shimon with a guarantee, so you cannot claim that I am not a legal party in this matter. Right? So the borrower sold the field, the creditor seized the field from the purchaser, and now the borrower is going to go litigate with the creditor and say, hey, you weren't allowed to seize that field. I'm going to pay you, or I already did pay you. I am a party to this matter because that purchaser is going to come back to me and want his money back. And you seize his land, even though I already sold it to him, you seize that land prematurely or illegally. And so that, that borrower who sold the field and now is suing the creditor who seized the field from the borrower's purchaser, that borrower has standing to bring this litigation. Now, there are those who say that Abaye said, even if Reuven sold the field to Shimon without a property guarantee, Reuven can dispute the legal claim in court, as he can say to the creditor, it is not amenable to me that Shimon would have a grievance against me for selling him property that was subsequently repossessed. And Abaye said, consider the case of Reuven, who sold a field to Shimon without a property guarantee, and disputants emerged disputing Reuven's prior ownership of the field. So as long as Shimon has not yet taken actual possession of the land, he can withdraw from the transaction and is not required to pay for the land. Once he has taken possession of the land, he cannot withdraw. As Reuven, the seller, can say to him, the purchase of the land was like purchasing a tied sack, whose content is unknown and might not be worth anything. Think Storage Wars. Since you are aware of that and accepted it, as you purchased it without a guarantee, you cannot withdraw your purchase. And from when is it that he has taken possession? It is from when he walks along the borders of the field to inspect them. This seems to be a different kinyan, a different act of acquisition than we've discussed before. Now we're on page 14b. And there are those who say, even if you bought the field with a property guarantee, the buyer cannot withdraw from the sale, as the seller can say to him, show me your document of authorization to repossess, which a court provides to a buyer when the land he purchased is seized from him by a third party who demonstrated that it did not belong to the seller. And then I will pay you. I do not wish to cancel the sale and reimburse you unless it is clear that the field is being taken from you legally, right? If, it's one thing if I sell you a field and then somebody comes along and repossesses it from you, claiming that I owe him money that I haven't been paid and that he had a land on that field, which I sold to you, and that's why he's seizing it from you. And then you're going to come to me looking for compensation. But what if this guy, I never borrowed money from him. He's a thug. He just showed up and took your field. That's your problem, not mine. I sold you the field. I have nothing to do with this thug. Right? So he wants to know that before I'm going to, entertain giving you your money back or having, mediation or litigation with you, that this guy who seized your field has a genuine connection to me and my historical issues with that property. Now, it was stated that with regard to a case of one who sells a field to another, and it is found subsequently that it did not belong to the seller, and the rightful owner repossesses the field from the buyer, and the buyer then demands reimbursement from the seller, Rav says that the buyer has the right to be repaid the money that he paid for the field, and he also has the right to compensation for the enhancement of the value of the field while it was in his possession, right? How he enhanced the field, the work and investment and money that he put into it, he can be reimbursed for that. And Shmuel says that he has the right to the money that he paid, but he does not have the right to compensation for the enhancement. So the students raised a dilemma before Rav Huna. What is the law if the seller specified that the buyer would receive payment for any enhancement in the value of the field in the event that the field is taken by the rightful owners? Is the reason for the opinion of Shmuel, right, who said that you're not entitled to the enhancement, is the reason for the opinion of Shmuel because the seller did not specify that the buyer would receive the enhancement when he sold him the field, but here in this case he did specify it? Or perhaps Shmuel's reason is that since the buyer is reimbursed by the seller, perhaps Shmuel's reason is that since the buyer is reimbursed, but the seller does not have the right to the land, i.e. he is not given back the land, then the transaction appears to have been a loan. And therefore, payment for enhancement of the field appears to be interest. And Rav Huna said to them, yes and no, the matter was unclear to him. Right? If I give you money for something, and then later you give me that money back, plus an additional sum, that looks like a loan with interest. And even though that's not how we entered into this matter, that's not what we were thinking about doing. In fact, you gave me money because I gave you a field. Later, the field was taken from you, so the money changed. So the money was restored. But because there was investment in the field, we added some more. But at the end of the day, money came this way, money went back, and when money went back, there was additional money paid. So it very much resembles a loan with interest, at least in the outcome. And in terms of usury and the prohibition on usury, we want to avoid even the appearance of usury. So is that why Shmuel says we don't pay for the enhancement in this situation? Or is it simply because they didn't specify that you'd be entitled to the enhancement at the time of the sale of the field? It was stated that Rav Nachman says that Shmuel says that he has the right to the money, but he does not have the right to the value of the enhancement, even if the seller specified in the deed of sale that he would compensate the buyer for the value of the enhancement in the event that the field was repossessed. What is the reason? Since the seller does not have the right to the land, the buyer appears to be standing and taking payment for the right to use his money, which is interest. Rava raised an objection to the statement of Rav Nachman. It is taught in a Mishna, Tractate Gittin 48b, that one cannot appropriate liened property that has been sold as payment for consuming produce or for enhancement of land, cases that will be explained later, or for the sustenance of a man's wife and his daughters after his death to which he committed in his marriage contract. And this is despite the fact that each of these financial liabilities or commitments predated the sale of the land. And these ordinances were instituted by the sages for the betterment of the world, as these liabilities are not of a fixed amount, and the purchaser of the lien property cannot assess the risk that he is assuming should some other person come to collect compensation from that property. And the Mishnah indicates that we do not appropriate liened property for these purposes, but we do appropriate unsold property. Lien property, meaning he sold it and there was a lien on it, we take it from his purchaser. Unsold means the guy who didn't pay, he owns property, we can seize that property to satisfy the loan. And in any event, it is taught in the Mishnah that one of these purposes is for the enhancement of land. So what? Is it not referring to a case where one purchases a field from a robber, in which case the field did not belong to the seller? And it says that the seller must pay the buyer the value of the field's enhancement, provided he has unsold property with which to satisfy this obligation. So the Gemara responds, no. This is referring to a case of a creditor, right? So it's a loan, not a purchase and sale of a field, but rather a loan of money, where one sold a field and his creditor subsequently repossessed it from the buyer due to the seller's prior debt to the creditor. In that case, the sale of the land was valid, and it does not appear to have been a loan. Therefore, the seller's payment of the enhancement does not even have the appearance of interest, and so we allow the buyer who had his land seized from him to now go sue the seller, right, who was also the creditor, not only to get his money back that he paid for the field, but even to be reimbursed for the enhancement that he invested into the field while it was in his possession. So the Gemara asks, if the Mishnah is referring to the case of a creditor, say that the first clause of the Mishnah, one cannot appropriate liened property for consuming produce. This is apparently referring to a case where the field was full of unharvested produce, and it was appropriated from the buyer along with the produce, right? This poor guy, he bought a field. He thought he had all the rights to it. He worked his butt off all summer long. Now he's finally going to get the payoff. The wheat is high in the field, right? And he's just a few days or weeks away from harvesting it, and he's going to make a big collection of money, a big collection of profit on all that work that he did all summer. And then he finds out that the guy who sold it to him owed money, and that guy's creditor comes and seizes this field because he has a lien on it. So what's he going to get? What is the buyer going to get back from the seller? Is it just the money he paid for the field? Is it going to be the amount of toil and investment that he put into the field? And what about the value of the produce that is standing in the field? Can he get that back too? So the buyer then claims payment for the value of the produce as well. And if the reference is to the case of a creditor, does a creditor have the right to appropriate produce from the buyer? But doesn't Shmuel say that a creditor collects the value of the enhancement of the field? And this indicates that he does collect the value of the enhancement, but he does not collect the produce, right? The produce still goes to the purchaser who farmed it. So rather, it is obvious that the Mishnah is referring to the case of a robber who stole the field and sold it. He had no right to sell that field. This was a scam. And the robbery victim who recovers his field, including the produce, from the buyer. And from the fact that the first clause is referring to a robber and a robbery victim, the latter clause, i.e. the case of the enhancement of the field, is also referring to a robber and a robbery victim. Rava's objection to Shmuel's opinion remains. So the Gemara rejects this premise. Are the cases comparable? This case, with regard to consuming produce, is as it is. And that case, with regard to the enhancement of land, is as it is. The former case is referring to a case of robbery, and the latter case is referring to the case of a creditor. They don't have to be consistent with each other. And the Gemara asks, but it is not taught that way in a Baraisa that elaborates on that Mishnah. The Baraisa states, what is the case in which one appropriates property for enhancement of land? It is a case where one robbed another of a field and it is appropriated by the court from his possession. When he collects payment, he collects the principal, i.e. the value of the field itself, from liened property, and he collects the enhancement from unsold property, right? So this buyer who bought a field and then had it taken from him by a creditor, or by the original owner, if the one who sold it to him was a robber. So he has rights now against the guy who sold him the field, either who was a borrower or who was a robber. And what is he going to look to for being made whole? He can go even after liened property of the seller, right? Other properties that he may have sold to get his principal back on the land that he bought that was then later confiscated from him. And in terms of the enhancement, the work that he put into it, he can only collect that from the unsold property of the guy who sold the field to him. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of the case if we say that the case is as it is taught in the Baraisa, which indicates that it is the robber who collects? From whom does the robber collect? Who owes him money? Rather, is it not referring to a case where one robbed another of a field and sold it to another person, i.e. a third party, and that third party invested in the field and enhanced it? So accordingly, when the court appropriates the land from the purchaser, he collects the value of the enhancement from the unsold property of the robber who sold it to him. So this interpretation poses a difficulty to Shmuel's opinion. And the Gemara answers, Shmuel could have said to you, did you not explain the Baraisa by adding information, i.e. that the robber sold the field to a third party? If so, you could also explain that rather than referring to a robber, it is referring to a creditor. And this interpretation would accord with the opinion of Shmuel. And the Gemara suggests, come in here another Baraisa that elaborates on the Mishnah and poses a difficulty to the opinion of Shmuel. What is the case in which one appropriates property for consuming produce? It is the case of one who robbed another of a field, and it is appropriated from his possession. When he collects payment, he collects the principal from liened property, and he collects the produce from unsold property. And the Gemara says, what are the circumstances? If we say that the case is as it is taught in the Baraisa, which indicates that it is the robber who collects, from whom does the robber collect? Rather, is it not referring to a case where one robbed another of a field and sold it to a third party, and that third party enhanced it? Rava said, with what are we dealing here? It is a case where one stole a field full of produce from another, and he consumed the produce, and he dug pits, ditches, and caves in the field, damaging it. When the robbery victim comes to collect the principal, the value of the field before it was damaged, he collects it from the robber's liened property. When the robbery victim comes to collect the value of the produce from the robber, he collects it from unsold property. Right? There's two victims. The one that the robber took the field from, claiming it was his, pretending it was his, maybe an absentee owner. And there's the other victim who he sold it to, right? This robber is a scammer in the middle. He creates two victims, who he took it from and who he sold it to. What recourse do they have? Perhaps to the robber's liened property, or perhaps to the robber's unsold property. Since this guy's robbing, I would not be surprised if he has neither. But let's keep going. Rabba bar Rav Huna said, it is a case where Gentile thugs took the field from the robber by force due to previous dealings between them. In this case, when we're talking about Gentile thugs, we're not talking about all the Gentile thugs that have approached and intimidated and robbed the Jewish people over the millennia. We're specifically talking about Roman thugs. Here's the note. It appears that this term, mesikin, is referring to soldiers who were released from the Roman army. And they would receive the right to land from the emperor, and they would dispossess the landowners that they had defeated to claim this land. And sometimes they were given specific plots of land, and other times they were given permission to take whatever they wished. So you could see, and I'm sure it wasn't just the Jews who suffered at the hands of these Roman thugs, but in the large Roman Empire, where these armies would go, they would conquer a whole region, a whole nation, etc. And then some of the soldiers would just settle there or create an estate there, and whatever they took, they took. And the poor people who had been living there before, out of luck, right? So what recourse do such people have? Let's see. It is a case where thugs took the field from the robber by force due to previous dealings between them. In that case, when the robbery victim comes to collect the principal, he collects it from liened property. And when the robbery victim comes to collect payment for the produce, he can collect only from unsold property. And the Gemara explains. So there's another note here that could help. Rashi writes that they took the field from the robber as a result of previous encounters with him. So the robber is a Jew who seized the field from another Jew, and then the thugs seized the field from the robber, right? Because the robber had been an informant, he had been a collaborator with the Romans, and the Romans don't really respect such people, they just use them. And so now they come and they just seize the robber's land. So now, the robber doesn't have the land anymore. It was taken from him. The original victim, what recourse does he have against the robber? That seems to be what we're asking. Again, it is a case where thugs took the field from the robber by force. due to previous dealings between them. In that case, when the robber's victim comes to collect the principal from the robber, he collects it from liened property, and when the robber's victim comes to collect payment for the produce, he can collect only from unsold property, again, of the robber. So the Gemara explains, Rava did not state his explanation of the Baraisa in accordance with the explanation of Rabba bar Rav Huna, because the phrase, it is appropriated from his possession, indicates that the field was taken from him legally and not by thugs. And Rabba bar Rav Huna did not state his explanation of the Baraisa in accordance with the explanation of Rava, because the phrase, it is appropriated from his possession, indicates that the field is appropriated in its unadulterated form and was not damaged. So that kind of wrinkle on the circumstances that you offered up before doesn't actually apply. We can't do that. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Rav Ashi stated that the Baraisa teaches its rulings disjunctively. According to Rav Ashi, the Baraisa is referring to a case where one robbed another of a field while it was full of produce, and he consumed the produce and he sold the field. And when, after the true owner recovers the field from the purchaser comes to collect the principal from the robber, i.e. the amount that he paid for the field, he collects it from the robber's liened property. When the robbery victim comes to collect payment for the produce, he collects only from the unsold property. And the Gemara raises a difficulty according to both Rava and Rabba bar Rav Huna. The money that the robber owes the robbery victim has the status of a loan by oral agreement, as it is not accompanied by documentation. And one who is owed a loan by oral agreement cannot collect from liened property. And the Gemara answers, here we are dealing with a case where the robber stood trial for his robbery and he was found guilty, and he subsequently sold the land. Since he had sold it after his liability was well known, the debt is equivalent to one that is written in a promissory note, and it can be collected from liened property. And the Gemara asks, if so, the owner should collect payment for the produce as well from liened property. The Gemara answers, it is referring to a case where the robber stood trial for the principal but did not yet stand trial for the produce. And the Gemara asks, and why was it stated without qualification? According to this explanation, the distinction is not between the principal and the produce, but rather between debts for which the robber stood trial and those for which he did not stand trial yet. And the Gemara answers, the normal way of things is that when a person files a claim, he first claims the principal, and only afterward does he file claims with regard to other property, such as produce. Maybe in the old world, in the ancient world. Right now, lawyers pounce and they file for everything and they make every claim all at once. But it seems like it was a much less litigious society back then, and they went one claim at a time. That's what I've got for us today. Let's go to a few questions. Jonathan, I have been confused by the concept of one who robs an entire field. I usually think of face-to-face robbery. So how can this happen to a plot of land? And my thought is absentee owner, local notices that the owner's been away for years. He says, this is my chance to make some money. He finds a sucker, right? Like, hey, you want to buy the Brooklyn Bridge? Hey, you want to buy this field? I'm not using it. Sure, I could make something out of it. And because this guy claims to be the owner, the purchaser believes it and buys it from this guy who has no rights to the field whatsoever. Later, when the owner comes back to town, it all comes out that it was a fraud. Bill, the Romans had this habit of creating colonies. Literally, our word colony comes from the Latin name for these settlements, coloniae, for a couple of reasons. One, because it's a really, really good way of pacifying a region. London was founded as such a colony after the local Celts, lost a revolt against Rome, for example. But the other reason is that armies are expensive, and Roman generals and later emperors found it really easy to pay their legions using the land that they had conquered. Thank you, Bill. Joseph, in Italian history, Sicilians were oppressed by invaders, and certain thugs were hired by barons to protect. At the expense of the population, this became the Italian mafia. In short, my question being, could Jewish landowners fight back in this way, minus the corruption? I mean, listen, the Jews tried to fight back against Rome, and it did not go well. Right? It did not go well. First, the initial war that ended in the destruction of the temple in the year 70, and then 65 years later, in the year 135, there was the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which seemed for a time like, wow, we threw the yoke of Rome off our shoulders, and then the Romans sent big legions and committed a true genocide against the Jewish people. And I think estimates are as high as 1 million Jews were massacred in that revolt. No, the Jews could not take on the Romans successfully. There was the Hanukkah story, which involved taking on the Syrian Greeks, but that was in the aftermath of Alexander's, conquering such a huge swath of the world. Then after he died, it quickly splintered, and there were sort of different portions of the Greek Empire. This was the Syrian Greeks that they revolted against, and they made it work. But it wasn't so easy, and it was really, after a bit of time passed, that they threw off the Greek yoke, but the Roman yoke arrived soon afterwards. In part because they got some help from Rome in throwing off the Greeks. I'm sure Bill could tell this story much better than I. So there was a beautiful throwing off of the Greek yoke in the Maccabean revolt. But did the Jews maintain, absolute sovereignty over the land for a long time? No, this was the Second Temple period. And it did not go well, and it wasn't that much longer. I think less than 200 years before the Second Temple was finally destroyed once and for all by Rome. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, at the regular time, 6 p.m.